My name's Matt Kennard. I'm an investigative journalist. My new book is Irregular Army: How the US Military Recruited Neo-Nazis, Gang Members and Criminals. Over the war on terror, the US military could no longer recruit or retain enough soldiers, so they changed regulations in a way I think is unprecedented in US military history. Around 2007 and 8, the US military were really in a quagmire in Iraq. There was a civil war, and they should have done what happened during Vietnam, which was the draft. But the Bush administration knew that the war in Iraq was so unpopular, they couldn't do that because it would be the straw that broke the camel's back and they'd see resistance. So in the absence of being able to do the draft, what they did was loosen regulations on a whole variety of different groups. Now, some of that was public. They raised the enlistment age from 35 to 42. They raised the standards for body weight. Many different elements were enfranchised. But what I looked into and investigated for the book was what they were doing more secretively. Primarily, that focused on neo-Nazis and white supremacists. So in the United States, you can actually call up neo-Nazi groups. They have websites. So I rang them up and said, how are your members doing in the US military? And all of them said, we've never had it so good. Our members can get in with swastikas, they can get in with SS bolts. After that initial revelation, I thought, well, this is a big story and one that really contradicts the fairy tale narrative of the war on terror, which was that Britain and America were taking freedom and democracy to Iraq, because you don't take freedom and democracy using neo-Nazis and white supremacists.
No more DEI, no more dudes in dresses, no more climate change worship or social justice or political correctness. We're done with all of that.
I started interviewing veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan who were neo-Nazis. One of them, Forrest Fogarty, who I went to meet in Tampa, Florida, told me that his commanders not only knew that he was a neo-Nazi, but told him that he liked the fact he was a neo-Nazi because he was a better warrior, and they'd send him on the hardest missions. And I heard this again and again and again. You don't need to be too much of a genius to work out what happens if you hand white supremacists an M4 and an M16 rifle and send them to a country full of brown people where there is basically legal impunity. But the other more scary part now for Americans is all these people are now back home in the US. And they didn't go to Iraq or Afghanistan because they believed in the stated mission of those wars. They went there because they said this to me, we wanted to get training in weapons courtesy of the US taxpayer. So they have that, and now they're back in the United States. And in all, we're talking about millions of veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan. This is a huge problem that will play out in America over the coming decades. A good window into what might happen is Timothy McVeigh, who before 9/11 had committed the worst domestic terrorism attack in US history in 1995 in Oklahoma City. Timothy McVeigh, a white supremacist, was a veteran of the first Gulf War. So you'll talk about many people with the same kind of ideology as him, who have been trained by the US military, who are now back in the United States. And I would say that they are a ticking time bomb, really, that we're waiting for a mass casualty attack. And in fact, in the book, I chart some of the more recent plots that have been hatched, not just by white supremacists and neo-Nazi veterans, but also active duty, so people serving in the US military currently. And luckily, up till now, the FBI has busted most of those big plots. But all it takes is one of those investigations to go wrong, or they don't know about a certain cell, and then you're talking about hundreds of Americans dead. So many of the people that are guilty of this policy, and it was primarily done during the Bush administration, but it was carried on by Obama, none of them have faced any consequences for this action. And this is a policy which will play out in America for decades. None of them have had any kind of accountability for the crimes that were committed in Iraq and Afghanistan because of this policy.
I call upon all nations to do everything they can to stop these terrorist killers.
This is not a topic that's talked about much because the war on terror was a bipartisan failure and catastrophe and crime. It wasn't just the Republicans, they were backed by the Democrats. So within Washington, many people don't want to talk about the war on terror anymore. But I think it's one of the big explanatory factors to explain the rise of Trump as well, because Trump pounced on unrest with the war on terror and criticism of the war on terror. If you look at his pitch when he initially got elected, and actually when he got elected for the second time, he said, we're not going to do any of this nation building anymore. We're not going to go abroad and spend American money on regime change and things like that. We now know that's complete rubbish, but he had a huge base that were enthused by that kind of rhetoric. And that was because they'd seen 20 years of the war on terror when America had been spending trillions of dollars occupying Iraq and Afghanistan and bombing countless other places in the Middle East.
The lovely country of Iran. It's a beautiful place. Would anybody like to go there?
I think the consequences also relate to the rise of fascism, because if you look at the rise of fascism the first time around in the early 20th century, it principally happened in Italy in 1919 when Mussolini created his fascist movement. Now, all his shock troops pretty much were veterans of the First World War, and they similarly were disenfranchised by the war. They were alienated from the society. They were angry that Italy hadn't made the territorial gains that they were promised, even though they were on the winning side in World War One. And he used that kind of disaffection and those veterans to be the base of his shock troops, the black shirts, which went to war with the left. They smashed up trade union offices. They smashed up left-wing newspapers. And then it spread to Germany, which was another case. A lot of Hitler's riots can be put down to the First World War, not just the Treaty of Versailles, which most people know about, which was when a highly punitive agreement was made at the end of World War One, which really strangled Germany. And Hitler's pitch was that we were humiliated by the winning powers. But also the same thing, many disaffected troops, alienated troops that formed the base of his Nazi party. So if you look at Trump, something similar happened. He used the war on terror, and he used the disaffection with the war on terror to really launch what I believe is, if not a fascist movement, one on its way to being a fascist movement. And it's arguable it already is. Also, understand that it's not just the neo-Nazis, gang members and criminals who were enfranchised. It was also the poor treatment of American soldiers, which has put America at risk. So at one point, 20% of American soldiers were said to have PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, in normal times, they would have been discharged or treated. But because they couldn't recruit or retain enough soldiers, they stopped treating them. They stopped diagnosing them. And when they did treat them, they didn't give them the therapy they needed or more expensive long-term treatment. They plied them with prescription drugs. And that ruined the minds of many American soldiers. I guess at the effects that had on the occupied populations, but many of those people are now back in the United States. And that's a toxic mix when you're talking about extremism, PTSD, gangs, criminals. It's a medley that is really sure to explode.
I saw so many veterans, my hand will never be the same.
I wanted to find out if the neo-Nazis and white supremacists I was interviewing were telling the truth, because there is a certain amount of bravado amongst veterans that needs to be checked. So I rang recruitment offices across the United States, covered up for the fact I'm British by saying I'd married an American, and said I wanted to join the US military. I said, can I come in and have a meeting? The only problem is I've got a swastika on my arm. Now, none of them said that would be a bar to enlistment. Most said, that's fine. Others said, I'm not sure what that is. So then I realized that this was a policy that was coming down from the brass and the Pentagon itself, that the regulations that are in place for obvious reasons weren't being enforced, and the recruiters weren't being trained in what to spot, because tattoos is the best way you can spot someone's extremism, because most people don't go into a recruitment office and say I'm a neo-Nazi because they know they're going to get barred. And then I was talking to investigators themselves who were telling me, well, we've seen cases of neo-Nazis and alerted their commanders of their units to it, and they've done nothing. In fact, they've tried to actually persecute the people that were blowing the whistle on this problem. This is another facet of the US military that you start to understand, is that when things go wrong, they always blame it on the individual soldier, because they want to take the attention away from the brass itself and the commanders and the political leaders. But actually, this was a policy that was coming right from the top. None of them have faced any kind of accountability for it. And if you look at local newspapers in the United States, which I do, you see that a lot of violence being perpetrated in the US at a low level is linked to the veteran community, and actually linked to the active duty community as well. So around bases, there's murders, there's drug trafficking, there's criminal activity. And often if you read these reports, you'll see further down the report that they'll say this person was a veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan, or they're actually serving on the base. The problem now is that this problem has been institutionalized. Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War, who was previously the Secretary of Defense but changed the name of the Department of Defense to the Department of War, which is more honest, I'll give him credit for that. He is the embodiment of this problem. During the War on Terror, when I was investigating these soldiers, I was trying to find evidence to alert people in positions of power to what was going on. Now he proudly displays far-right and white nationalist tattoos on his arm. He's got a Jerusalem cross, which is a neo-Crusader imagery. He's got Deus Vult, which means God wills it in Latin, which is another piece of Crusader imagery. He's got Kafir written in Arabic on his arm, which is his signal that he sees Islam as a civilizational threat. So these are all things that in normal times you wouldn't even be able to get into the US military with, but he's the most powerful person in the Pentagon, which is a crazy situation. Also in 2021, it's reported that he wasn't even allowed to serve during Joe Biden's inauguration because one of his fellow soldiers alerted his superiors to his extremist tattoos. So you've got this guy at the head of the most powerful military in human history. And in Congress, when he was being confirmed, he said, we're no longer going to focus on extremism because it's a political witch hunt. So that was an invitation to neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and other extremists to enter the US military. He also said, we're no longer going to deal with these, quote, stupid rules of engagement, which is a signal to the hundreds of thousands of soldiers serving under him that they can commit war crimes with impunity. So we're in a very, very scary situation where the complete deregulation of the US military, the complete discarding of regulations has now become institutionalized, and the extremists are at the wheel. We're talking about a country, the US, which spends as much on its military as the next 10 countries combined. It has 800 military bases around the world. It has 11 carrier battle groups, which can go anywhere at any time. This is a force that has not had any kind of precedent in history. And when it's ruled by someone like Pete Hegseth, that is a worry for every single human being on the planet.
We see ourselves as part of this negotiation as well. We negotiate with bombs.
Pete Hegseth subscribes to this end times idea that there'll be a huge conflagration in the Middle East, which will end with Jesus Christ returning to earth and rapturing up to heaven all the Christian believers, including Hegseth. So when you have someone like that in power, it is extremely, extremely worrying and actually is guiding policy. It's not silly or conspiratorial to think that these ideas were a large part behind the war in Iran, alongside obviously doing what Israel says. What's not ever made is the connection with the war on terror, where this kind of free-for-all was allowed to take off. And Hegseth is actually the perfect embodiment of that period. So when Democrats and Republicans try to wring their hands of Trump and his administration, we should actually say to them, no, you create the conditions for this monster. And we need to now work out how we stop this juggernaut, because it's unclear if Trump and his coterie will hand over power to bring it back to fascist Germany again. They used the Reichstag fire in 1933 to pass the enabling laws, which basically got rid of German democracy and instituted a dictatorship. I think we're one large-scale terrorist attack away from that possibly happening in the United States as well. This is a situation that we haven't been in my lifetime, and the whole world needs to work out how we try and stop this juggernaut. On the UK side, I think that the movement needs to build to evict and kick out the US military presence in this country, because we have 13 US military bases, over 12,000 troops, plus an unknown number of special forces that are permanently based here. Zach Polanski of the Green Party is the first mainstream politician who's come out and said we should tell them to leave. And we should tell them to leave because we don't want to be hitched to this brutal empire. We don't want to be hitched to these politicians like Pete Hegseth. And all the troops in the UK are under the control of Pete Hegseth, and all the troops in the UK are under the control of Donald Trump. And that should scare people, and I think is scaring people. And this is an issue I've been working on for many, many years, and no one's really been that interested. But now the reality of it, when you see what's happening in the White House and who's there, is really changing it. So I think our focus as British people should be trying to extricate ourselves from this military system. It's not impossible to do. In 1966, President Charles de Gaulle in France kicked out all US troops and they've never returned. It's definitely something we can do and we should be focused on. And it's what we can do to stop our complicity, because our sites and our bases around the world are key to the US military system. Just one example was recently in Iran, when Keir Starmer initially refused to allow UK bases to be used to attack Iran, but then reversed course and allowed RAF Fairford in Gloucestershire to be used to attack Iran. Now, why was it so important that he allowed that base? Because that's the only forward operating location in Europe that the US has, which means they can send heavy bombers. And images came out soon after of bombs being loaded on to those heavy bombers to go and smash up Iran. We also allowed the US to bomb Iran via Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, which is one of our overseas territories. It shows how important the UK remnants of empire is to the US empire and the US military.
He said we can't use the island to land. That was the first.
Regulations on neo-Nazis, criminals, gang members are in place for a reason. It's quite obvious what will happen if you allow these groups to sign up. And the reason they allowed them to sign up was not ideological. The Bush administration, I don't think they cared that neo-Nazis, but the reason was that they couldn't recruit enough soldiers. They didn't think about the consequences, mainly because the consequences are being played out now when they're not in power and that they don't have to answer for it. Obviously, the populations of Iraq and Afghanistan, they knew about it. And in fact, there was one very famous massacre in Iraq in 2006 called the Mahmoudiya massacre, where a group of American soldiers went to a house near the checkpoint they'd been working on, separated the 14-year-old girl in the house from her family, went into the room where the family were, killed them all, then went into the room where the 14-year-old girl was and raped her and then burnt down the house. They told the US military that was the work of insurgents, which I saw again and again and again, that the US military would accept that explanation and did accept it. And they did that again and again because it meant they didn't have to deal with the fact that their soldiers were committing massacres. But actually, in the end, a soldier in that platoon had a crisis of conscience and told the superiors what happened, and it came out. Now, who led that massacre? A guy called Stephen D. Green, who was on record as saying, my main preoccupation in life is wanting to kill Iraqis. Now, Stephen D. Green got into the US military on a moral waiver, which was a program which went stratospheric during the War on Terror, because the moral waiver program is usually a small program where they allow felons and people guilty of serious misdemeanors to sign up because they wanted to recruit more and more troops. Moral waivers were given out like candy. Stephen D. Green was one of them. So you can see how the atrocities in Iraq were directly linked to the policy of loosening regulations. And again, with the neo-Nazis, it was quite hard to correlate atrocities to them in Iraq and Afghanistan, mainly because none of them are reported. We know a fraction of the massacres and atrocities that were committed in Iraq and Afghanistan. We only know some of it from what they did when they got back to the United States, where the rule of law can't be as easily discarded. So in one case, Kenneth Eastridge, a soldier, came back and killed a fellow soldier with another soldier. In the aftermath of that murder, his MySpace page was publicized where he had SS bolts. He was proudly displaying them while serving in Iraq. And in the court case for that, one of the soldiers that was with Eastridge said, we used to go around Baghdad out of a tank just taking pot shots at locals. And then another soldier said at least one was hit. So you can see what the kind of culture was in Iraq, where these people were just seen as subhuman, effectively. And I talked to veterans, not extremist veterans, but veterans who came back and started activism against the war, about the culture within the US military during Iraq and Afghanistan. And they said it was a racist war. It was presented like that. Commanders would call Iraqis Hajis, which is a racist derogatory term. They said, we saw them as subhuman. We saw them as people that needed to be contained and controlled. So what do you think is going to happen if you have that kind of psychology towards the occupied populations and complete legal impunity, because no atrocities, or very, very few atrocities, the people who committed them were ever convicted or tried?
They all lived by the oath that Patrick Henry made immortal: give me liberty or give me death.
There's a long history of this in the United States military, Vietnam, one massacre really became famous and broke through to the mainstream. That was My Lai massacre, which was revealed by Seymour Hersh. But if you read historians who looked more into what was happening in Vietnam, they say that this was like a weekly occurrence. There were massacres all the time, but they just weren't reported and no one knew about them. And in fact, if Seymour Hersh hadn't done that work about My Lai, we wouldn't know about that massacre as well, because the US military's philosophy is deny, 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 deny until denial becomes impossible. And then they'll have to do something. The other part of that is when they have to do something, they always palm it off on the soldiers themselves. They say it's a few bad apples. Don't look at us. Don't look at the policies we're instituting, which have allowed this to happen, which is much more important. And this goes on and on and on.
During this summit, any of the leaders expressed any concerns on the possible violation of international law on the attack on Iran?
No, actually the opposite. They felt they were very dangerous. They were very relieved because they could get hit too. They were very relieved. No, we never discussed that. No, it would be the opposite.
I would say the MAGA movement is an outgrowth of the war on terror, because if you look at Trump's pitch, he presented himself as an outsider that was going against Washington. We know that was rubbish, but that was how he sold himself. And a lot of it was about going against the war on terror, and a lot of it was about going against nation building and foreign wars and putting America first. And this is the same rhetoric as Mussolini, making Italy great again. And it was the same conditions after the First World War and after the war on terror. So I'd say you couldn't have MAGA really without the war on terror. You just have to look at the power of the US military within American society. I would say it's by far the most important institution in the US society. Half the congressional budget goes on the US military. According to some estimates, $1.4 trillion a year. You'll talk about millions of people serving in it. So in that situation, how can you not have dynamics and trends within the US military not percolate out into wider society? And we have seen it. Vigilantism, violence, fascism, all that has been allowed to fester in the US military, and it, through the MAGA movement, has percolated out into wider society. And also the political culture that was created by the war on terror, the heightened paranoid culture that we're under attack from outsiders or internal enemies, principally Muslims. That was all started during the war on terror, and Trump has seized the opportunity with Elam, but he is just taking advantage of what was already put in place. Also, the massive concentration of power in the executive branch. During the war on terror, Dick Cheney infamously started what was called the imperial presidency, where he tried to concentrate power in the executive branch, bypass the legislative branch. Trump's recent crimes, including Venezuela and Iran, no one even proposed that this was going to go for a vote. It wasn't even thought. And that is a consequence of that imperial presidency, which Bush put in place and was carried on by Obama. So MAGA and the monster that heads the movement is inextricably linked to the war on terror. The reason that link is not made is because the war on terror was a bipartisan catastrophe and crime, and they don't want to talk about their own role in creating Trump.
These demands are not open to negotiation or discussion.
One of the consequences of America's obsession with the military is that institution has pulled resources and wealth from the rest of society. You have a completely devastated society in many ways, massive levels of poverty, huge prison population, huge amounts of drug abuse, and also people can't get jobs, unemployment is high. That's a medley of factors, and you can't put it all down to the US military, but the US is now what's called a stratocracy, which is ruled by the military. And those kind of societies collapse eventually. If the US empire is going to collapse, internal collapse is more likely than being defeated abroad. The economics of it is a huge part of it. That got worse in 2008. And in fact, that was at one point in 2008, there were people within the US military who were actually delighted, because with a much broader pool of unemployed people, the military became more attractive for the first time for a long time. And they took that opportunity. But you can't put the rise of fascism, MAGA, just down to what happened to the US military. Of course, it has economic roots as well. But the point is the economic roots are understood and talked about, but the US military part of it is not talked about at all. Part of that also is that it's a protected institution in a way no other institution is protected. You cannot criticize the US military. The list of epithets you get called if you criticize the US military is long. And that happened to whistleblowers who were talking about the infiltration of neo-Nazis, gang members, and criminals and others during the war on terror. Daryl Johnson, the senior domestic terrorism analyst at the Department of Homeland Security, released a report, which was actually a very important report, where he said, look, the veteran community and the active duty community are more susceptible to recruitment by white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups than a lot of different groups. Any rational country or government would have looked at that and said, okay, we'll start dealing with this, or look, because we don't want a mass casualty domestic terrorism attack. What happened to Daryl Johnson happened to many other people. He was put out to pasture by the DHS. He lost his job and was persecuted. And I saw that again and again with whistleblowers within the US military. Anyone raising their head above the parapet and saying we shouldn't allow this to happen was persecuted and destroyed, because they couldn't slow down, and anyone raising the alarm would have meant public pressure would build for them to slow down.
Since 1776, America's story has been a tale of freedom, overcoming oppression, good defeating evil,
and faith overcoming every challenge and every foe. We had everybody was winning, and we're going to continue stronger, maybe stronger.
I think that America is now a stratocracy, a society ruled by the military. And I think that that's a sign of collapse. And in fact, there's a book by a guy called Arthur Farrell called The Fall of the Roman Empire, The Military Explanation. Now, Arthur Farrell said, look, if you look at what happened to the Roman military in the late 4th century and 5th century, they started recruiting soldiers from outside of Rome, so rival tribes. The troops themselves were much more ill-disciplined. And he said that when the fighting force became degraded, it was impossible for Rome to project its power in the same way. And another clue is in the fact that America can't win a war. They've just had their arse handed to them by Iran. They went in and killed a lot of people and kidnapped the president in Venezuela, but the same government that he headed is in place, admittedly with a more pliant ruler, but they aren't good at enforcing their military power, and they don't ever leave with a situation which is what you'd want to happen before you do the attack. Look at Afghanistan. They occupied Afghanistan, spent trillions for 20 years, and then within a few days, or maybe even the day they left, the Taliban took over. Vietnam, you saw the same thing. They left in 1973, and then South Vietnam fell in 1975. So that does hold out some hope for us, the rest of the world. You know, the US military and the people that write the policy in the White House and the Pentagon, they're not good at running an empire. They're not like previous empires in that way. They're very, very incompetent. And then add to that the current Department of War head, Pete Hegseth. You know, I wouldn't trust him to make me a sandwich. In the short term, it's a recipe for a lot of people dying. Maybe in the long term, American power is going to be fatally damaged. And in fact, I think Iran has done a good job of that, to be honest. But in the short term, a wounded tiger is much more dangerous than a healthy tiger. And America is a wounded tiger. The other problem for the world is that America economically, for a long time now, has been outcompeted by China. And China's economy will soon be bigger than America's. What America leads at is its military prowess. No one can touch America militarily. So if you are in Washington and you're trying to exert your power, you're going to say, well, we've got this military that no one can touch. We need to use it. That's our comparative advantage. And I think that's what you're seeing with the Trump administration. They know that the military is what they lead in, and they're going to use it again and again and again to enforce their will and try and rectify the economic gap that's developing with China. National security strategy last year, Trump's one, which gave birth to the so-called Dunn-Roe doctrine. If you read that, it just effectively gives the US military the right to do anything they want in the whole of the Western Hemisphere. They couch it under the rubric of combating drug trafficking, but they say anywhere we believe drugs are being trafficked, the US military can go in and kill people. That is new. You know, the US military has never bombed South America before Venezuela. So Trump is breaking all these norms, breaking these historical precedents. And I think it's only going to get worse. He's talked about going into Cuba. There's already been a brutal siege of Cuba. I mean, he's also talked about invading Greenland, which is a Danish territory, and Canada. So there's no limits to him. The US president has complete control over the US military. And this isn't to even go into the intelligence agencies, the CIA, which operates secretly, and we barely know anything the CIA is up to. And that is the personal force of the US president as well. So in some ways, when you look at foreign policy in the US, it's a dictatorship, which is run by a president completely without any accountability mechanisms. And that's often why they say presidents like focusing on foreign policy, because they don't have to deal with the legislative problems that domestic policy comes with. So I think it's going to get worse and worse and worse. Although I think the Iranian defeat hopefully has stopped the US military for a while. Who knows if it will carry on that way, but they were very, very shocked by Iran's ability to shut the Strait of Hormuz. They were shocked by Iran's ability to maintain the government in the face of huge subversion by the Israelis and the US. And hopefully they'll see that they can't, as easy as they think, collapse regimes, bomb regimes into submission.